The winter of 1943 in Krakow was not marked by the roaring of guns or the echo of bombs, but by an oppressive, suffocating silence. The factories and homes stood, at first glance, seemingly untouched, yet inside the hollow walls of the city's Jewish quarter, the human heartbeat had slowed to a whisper. It is in this quiet that horror finds its most piercing form, in the absence, in the void left behind by the people who once filled these streets with life. And it is here, in the aftermath, that Schindler's eyes fall upon a scene both trivial and monumental, a small pile of hinges. At first, the hinges appear to be nothing more than scraps of metal, discarded and overlooked. But as the camera lingers, the audience begins to sense the magnitude of what is missing. Hinges, once part of doors that open to laughter, to warmth, to human lives, now rest in solitary piles, cold, silent, and meaningless without their purpose. Each hinge is a mute witness, a fragment of a structure that no longer shelters anyone. They are the proof of erasure, that homes, like the people who lived within them, have been systematically dismantled, leaving only metal, wood, and memory. The horror in this scene is not loud. It does not need to scream, for the imagination of the viewer is more powerful than any explicit depiction of death. The hinges, small as they are, speak volumes. They whisper stories of families torn apart, of laughter cut short, of routines abandoned forever. And in that quiet, the mind constructs the unimaginable. Every hinge represents a lost door, every lost door a lost life, and every lost life a world extinguished. The silence is deafening, the emptiness palpable, and it forces a confrontation with the reality that genocide is as much about absence as it is about presence, about what is taken away, rather than what is inflicted. Steven Spielberg's decision to frame the camera on this small pile is not an accident of aesthetics, but a masterstroke of moral clarity. The camera does not linger on corpses, nor on the spectacle of violence, yet it captures a truth deeper than any battlefield scene, that genocide leaves traces not only in the bodies of its victims, but in the objects they leave behind, in the homes they once inhabited, and in the unbearable quiet of what remains. By focusing on the hinges, the film transforms a trivial object into a profound symbol of collective loss. It forces the viewer to reconcile with the idea that history's scars are not always painted in blood, but sometimes in the faint glint of metal, reflecting the light of what was and is no more. Oskar Schindler himself stands at the periphery of this revelation. Once a man motivated by profit, his gaze now shifts inward as the small pile becomes a mirror to his conscience. The hinges, in their quiet insistence, demand recognition. They accuse him, not in words but in presence, asking why life was spared for some and denied to others. The silence does not absolve, it condemns. The emptiness of the room is a courtroom, and the hinges the witnesses. It is here, in this subdued devastation, that Schindler's moral transformation begins. A slow, almost imperceptible awakening to the weight of human loss and the responsibility of those who survive. The genius of this moment is in its restraint. The audience is not directed to look away, nor overwhelmed by spectacle. Instead, Spielberg allows the quiet to settle, to linger, to press upon the viewer with the weight of inevitability. It is a masterclass in cinematic understatement, a lesson in how the unseen can be more horrifying than the seen. The hinges are banal, yet their meaning is monumental. They are the silent heralds of absence, the smallest artifacts carrying the largest truths. And in this quiet, in this stillness, the screams of the past echo most clearly. As the camera slowly pulls back, the room's emptiness expands, and the city itself seems to breathe a collective sigh of mourning. The audience is left not with images of blood or brutality, but with the haunting suggestion that human history is written as much in absence as in presence. And in the quiet aftermath of what has been taken, the hinges remain, small, metallic, unassuming, yet heavy with the weight of a world that once was. Here, the silence is not merely a lack of sound, but a presence in itself, demanding acknowledgement, reflection, and remembrance. A hinge is a simple object. In ordinary life, it is barely noticed, a functional utilitarian piece of metal that allows doors to swing open and closed, connecting spaces and enabling movement. Yet in this scene from Schindler's List, the hinge transcends its ordinary role. It becomes a profound symbol of what genocide leaves behind, fragments of a life systematically erased. This small pile of hinges is no longer a mere mechanical artifact, it is testimony. Each piece carries the weight of the absent homes, absent families, absent laughter, absent sorrow, and absent futures. Poignancy of the hinges lies in their banality. They are not gold, jewels, or objects of historical prestige. They are humble, overlooked, and utilitarian. And yet, it is precisely their ordinariness that makes them unbearable. These hinges represent the everydayness of life that the Holocaust sought to obliterate. They remind the audience that the machinery of genocide does not destroy only people. It destroys the ordinary routines, the simple domestic rhythms that give life texture and meaning. Kitchens, bedrooms, workshops, schools, all these places, now emptied of human presence, leave behind only small, inconsequential items like these hinges. and in their smallness lies the enormity of absence. Hinges are connectors. They join doors to frames, rooms to each other, households to the world. But when the doors they were meant to serve are gone, the hinges' purpose is nullified. They hang in limbo, frozen reminders of the lives they were meant to facilitate. Spielberg's framing of these objects emphasizes the cruel irony. The small, functional components designed to allow life and movement now testify to the death of both. It is a visual metaphor for disconnection, the severing of people from their homes, their communities, and ultimately from the very possibility of continuity. The hinges are silent chroniclers of the rupture between the world that was and the world that remains. In examining this symbolic weight, one realizes that the scene operates on multiple temporal layers. There is the moment captured in the film, Schindler walking through the room, noticing the pile and internalizing its meaning. Then there is the historical moment, the Holocaust itself, where the systematic eradication of Jewish life turned cities, homes, and communities into hollow shells. And finally, there is the timeless layer, the moral and philosophical reflection it prompts in the audience, the realization that objects can carry memory, that absence itself is a witness, and that even the most trivial remnants of humanity can speak volumes when those they once served are gone. The hinges also function as a mirror to Schindler's own conscience. In the earlier parts of the story, Schindler's perspective is that of an opportunist, a businessman fascinated by profit and survival. But here, standing amidst the silent detritus of erased lives, the ordinary object forces an extraordinary reflection. The hinges demand that he reckon with his own complicity, with the enormity of the machinery he is part of, and with the choices that define the thin line between action and inaction. They are catalysts, not inanimate objects, but instruments of moral awakening, small enough to seem insignificant, yet powerful enough to disrupt the trajectory of a man's life. Cinematically, Spielberg's choice to focus on hinges rather than corpses or rubble highlights a subtle genius. The camera does not sensationalize horror, it invites the audience into a meditative engagement with absence. It asks the viewer to consider the lives that created and used these objects, to imagine the hands that installed them, the doors they swung, the families they protected, and the spaces they defined. It is a quiet pedagogy, teaching history not through spectacle, but through the intimate and tragic intimacy of objects left behind. The hinges become vessels of memory, carrying not just the weight of metal, but the weight of humanity lost. Finally, this pile of hinges embodies the paradox of survival and destruction. The objects endure even as the people are erased. They are relics of continuity amidst discontinuity, fragments of permanence in a landscape of obliteration. Their presence is a silent accusation. They exist to remind us that history is neither abstract nor distant. It resides in the small, overlooked details that bear witness to life and its loss. In this sense, a small pile of hinges becomes nothing less than a monument, a subtle, enduring, and haunting testament to the lives that once were, and the void that genocide leaves behind. The corridors of Schindler's factories were filled with the mechanical rhythm of production, the steady clatter of machines, the metallic echoes of hammers and presses, the hum of conveyor belts moving endlessly forward. But beyond this industrial noise lay a darker, more terrifying machinery, a system designed not just to produce goods, but to reduce human beings to raw materials, to components that could be calculated, counted, and ultimately erased. The small pile of hinges, seemingly innocuous in their silence, are part of this wider tableau, fragments of an existence methodically dismantled. The Holocaust, in its most horrifying manifestation, was not chaotic, it was meticulously organized. Camps, ghettos, labor assignments, and the movement of prisoners were all subject to cold efficiency, a bureaucracy of death that treated humans as items in a ledger. Just as the hinges in Schindler's office or factory were counted, sorted, and stored, so too were lives catalogued, assigned numbers, and moved along invisible conveyor belts toward extermination. Each hinge in the pile becomes a metaphor for this reduction, a tangible emblem of how human complexity was stripped down into parts, objects, and statistics. A life, once vibrant and multidimensional, could, in the machinery of genocide, be reduced to a number, a checkbox, a label, or a mere fragment like these hinges. It is here that the intersection of industrial technology and moral collapse becomes most apparent. Factories and workshops, designed to create and sustain life, are now intertwined with the machinery of death. Schindler himself navigates this paradox. His munitions business is feeding a war that destroys, yet he discovers ways to subvert that system, to introduce elements of humanity amidst the cold calculus. The hinges, as silent witnesses, echo the same tension. Their existence is utilitarian, yet they also bear witness to the moral consequences of industrialized annihilation. The assembly line metaphor extends beyond metal and machinery to the broader society complicit in genocide. Each administrative form, each deportation list, each bureaucratic decision functions like a gear in a larger engine. Life is reduced to efficiency, survival becomes an algorithm. Yet within this cold mechanism, the small, overlooked objects, doors, hinges, personal belongings, retain a resonance that the machinery cannot erase. They testify to the human stories that intersected with these mechanical processes, reminding viewers that history is composed not only of the visible acts of oppression, but also of the ordinary spaces and objects that once held human life. In this context, Spielberg's framing of the hinges takes on an almost allegorical dimension. The camera lingers on them in close focus, isolating them from their original context, much like a historian isolates artifacts to understand a vanished culture. Each hinge is a unit of both meaning and loss, emblematic of the systematic reduction of life to material. They are part of an invisible assembly line of destruction, where homes are dismantled, communities are disassembled, and humans are processed, calculated, and discarded. In the cinematic language of the film, they represent the silent industrialization of death, a mechanized process that leaves no dramatic spectacle, only quiet devastation. The horror then is dual, technical and existential. Technically, it is the methodical, almost clinical efficiency of the genocide, the way human lives were quantified and processed like objects on a production line. Existentially, it is the realization that the ordinary, hinges, doors, rooms, utensils, can become the only evidence of the extraordinary crime committed. The small pile of hinges is not merely a pile of metal, it is a relic of human fragility crushed beneath the wheels of systemic brutality. It is a microcosm of the assembly line itself, small, repetitive, unassuming, yet imbued with immense historical and moral weight. The industrialized horror of the Holocaust is reflected in every detail of this scene. The hinges, detached and inert, speak of lost utility. They were meant to allow doors to open and close to facilitate life, yet now they are frozen in obsolescence. In this way, they mirror the lives of the victims, whose potential, movement, and agency were stripped away by the machinery of war. Schindler, standing amid these remnants, is confronted with the chilling realization that survival within such a system is not merely a matter of luck or courage, but a moral engagement with an overwhelming, mechanized atrocity. By connecting the small, human-scale image of the hinges to the large-scale industrial processes of genocide, Spielberg achieves a cinematic metaphor of unparalleled subtlety and force. The scene encapsulates how genocide operates both in intimate and systemic terms, how the machinery of annihilation works through numbers, systems, and routines, and yet leaves behind minute traces that testify to the human cost. The hinges are banal, but they are charged with the energy of absence, the weight of erasure, and the haunting echoes of lives processed and lost. In the quiet of the room, the audience is invited to witness not just the aftermath, but the method itself, the assembly line of human destruction. Oskar Schindler had always walked the line between opportunism and conscience, a man fascinated by profit yet surrounded by the growing shadows of atrocity. In the early days, his factory was a sanctuary of commerce, producing goods and accumulating wealth, while the world outside plunged into chaos and human suffering. But in this moment, as he stands before the small pile of hinges, something shifts. It is not a dramatic revelation. There is no thunderclap, no cinematic explosion of emotion. Instead, it is the subtle, inexorable pressure of truth pressing upon him, a quiet awakening that will change the course of his life. The hinges, cold and inert, are now transformed into instruments of conscience. They speak in a language Schindler cannot ignore. Each piece, seemingly trivial, carries the weight of absence. The doors they once fastened, the homes they once secured, the families they once protected. Schindler's gaze lingers, and for the first time he is forced to reckon not with numbers or logistics, but with the human cost of his enterprise. He sees the faces of those who are gone, the laughter that once echoed through these rooms, and the haunting emptiness that remains. The quiet is not merely silence, it is accusation, a moral imperative that demands recognition. This moment crystallizes the paradox of Schindler's existence. He is both participant and witness, beneficiary and observer. The hinges serve as a mirror, reflecting not only the devastation wrought by systemic genocide, but also the choices he must now confront. Survival, profit, and indifference are no longer sufficient shields against moral responsibility. The small, silent pile forces him into reflection, revealing the stark reality that the machinery of annihilation operates regardless of individual intention, but that intervention, however subtle, however delayed, can still alter outcomes. The awakening is both personal and universal, a recognition that witnessing is not enough, and that conscience must translate into action. Spielberg's cinematic language in this scene mirrors Schindler's internal journey. The camera lingers close on the hinges, then pulls back slowly to include Schindler in the frame, allowing the audience to feel the weight of his realization. the silence envelops him, and through that silence the enormity of responsibility becomes tangible. It is in the quiet, the absence of spectacle, that moral awakening finds its purest form. The Hinges, banal yet symbolic, catalyze a transformation that is both subtle and profound. Schindler begins to understand the true meaning of human value and the tragic consequences of failing to act in the face of evil. The quiet awakening is also a meditation on the limits of perception. Schindler does not witness the bodies, the screams, or the explicit violence of the Holocaust in this moment. Instead, he confronts absence, the erased lives, the dismantled homes, the objects left behind. It is a form of horror that requires imagination, empathy, and reflection, and in facing it, Schindler steps into a deeper understanding of his role as a moral agent. The Hinges are a catalyst, but the awakening comes from within, an acknowledgement that wealth, power, and convenience are meaningless in the face of human suffering unless they are wielded with conscience. This scene is a testament to the subtle power of narrative restraint. Spielberg avoids sensationalism, choosing instead to explore the intimate, almost imperceptible ways in which human beings confront truth. Schindler's awakening is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, gradual, and deeply psychological. It reflects the uncomfortable reality that moral consciousness often emerges not from grand gestures but from small, almost mundane encounters with evidence and absence. In this sense, the small pile of hinges becomes a conduit for ethical reflection, a symbol of how ordinary objects can provoke extraordinary insight. Finally, Schindler's quiet awakening is a prelude to action. The scene lays the groundwork for the decisions he will make, the risks he will take, the lives he will save. It is a turning point not marked by spectacle, but by the subtle alignment of conscience and opportunity. The Hinges, unassuming in themselves, carry the gravitas of history, reminding both Schindler and the audience that inaction has consequences, and that moral courage often begins in silence, in observation, and in reflection. The awakening is quiet, but its reverberations will be felt in lives spared and histories rewritten. More than 2 decades after its release, The Small Pile of Hinges scene continues to resonate with audiences around the globe, not because it depicts violence, but because it embodies absence, the most haunting echo of genocide. In a world often saturated with images of blood and battle, Spielberg's choice to linger on a pile of inconspicuous metal pieces feels radical. It is a quiet insistence that horror can be experienced through suggestion, reflection, and imagination. The Hinges, inert as they seem, vibrate with the weight of human loss, and in this vibration, they become a universal language of grief, memory, and conscience. The scene's haunting quality lies in its paradox. The smaller and more mundane the object, the larger its symbolic magnitude. The Hinges are banal, yet they bear witness to the incomprehensible. They remind us that genocide does not only leave bodies behind, it leaves voids, broken routines, and fragmented traces of human existence. Museums, memorials, and history books can tell the story of numbers and dates, but objects like these Hinges evoke an emotional truth that cannot be quantified. The erasure of everyday life, the subtle disappearance of entire worlds. It is a tragedy recorded in metal, wood, dust, and silence, rather than blood and screams. Culturally, the scene challenges audiences to confront the ways in which history is remembered. The Holocaust, as one of the most documented atrocities in human history, risks being reduced to statistics, charts, and photographs. Yet here, Spielberg forces a reconsideration. The pile of Hinges becomes a mnemonic device, a tool that arrests the mind and imagination. It asks the viewer to consider what is left after destruction, to dwell on what cannot be replaced, and to reflect on the cumulative absence of homes, families, and communities. The Hinges are not simply part of the past, they actively demand engagement from the present. Historically, the scene functions as a microcosm of the Holocaust's broader machinery. The Hinges symbolize the efficiency with which lives were catalogued, belongings repurposed, and spaces emptied. But they also symbolize resilience, memory, and the human need to bear witness. They are fragments that survived when so much else was obliterated. In this way, they become not only testimony of loss, but also instruments of remembrance, carrying lessons for future generations. The audience is confronted with the question, if such small, overlooked objects can speak so powerfully of human atrocity, what are we failing to notice in the present? How often do we overlook subtle signs of moral failure, both in ourselves and in society? The emotional resonance of the scene is magnified by its moral subtlety. Unlike depictions of raw violence, the Hinges require the viewer to actively participate, to imagine the lives they once facilitated, and to feel the weight of absence. This participatory aspect transforms the audience into witnesses, sharing in Schindler's awakening and moral reckoning. It is a quiet pedagogy, teaching empathy, reflection, and the profound consequences of inaction. The Hinges, mundane though they may seem, become instruments of ethical engagement, reminding viewers that history is experienced not only through events, but through reflection on what is left behind. Finally, the scene continues to haunt because it speaks to the human capacity for both cruelty and conscience. The small pile of hinges embodies the fragility of life under systematic oppression, and simultaneously, it marks the possibility of moral awakening, choice, and action. The tension between absence and responsibility, between what is lost and what can still be preserved, reverberates beyond the historical moment of the Holocaust. In this quiet, cinematic space, Spielberg has created an enduring meditation on memory, history, and morality, a moment that transcends its filmic context to challenge viewers across time and culture. In the end, the small pile of hinges is a reminder that true horror is not always loud, and true remembrance is not always monumental. It is found in the quiet corners, in the overlooked fragments, in the spaces where absence speaks louder than presence. The scene continues to resonate because it captures the essence of what it means to bear witness, to acknowledge loss, to reflect on responsibility, and to allow the smallest of objects to tell the largest of stories. And in this resonance, the world continues to feel the weight of what was, the silence of what remains, and the haunting truth that memory itself is both fragile and eternal.